So I hope everybody's doing well this morning. It's been a while since we've had a talk, so I'm happy to be able to do it again with everybody. Let's see where we are. We're, of course, speaking about this Jijuyu Zanmai section of Dogen Zenji's Bendowa. And the last few times, it's been several weeks now, we talked about this part that says, this part of this piece of the Jijuyu Zanmai section of Bendowa. He says, there is a path through which the Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi of all things returns to the person in Zazen, and whereby that person and the enlightenment of all things intimately and imperceptibly assist each other. So the new part that I wanted to talk about this morning, the additional part is next. Therefore, this Zazen person without fail drops off body and mind, cuts away previous tainted views and thoughts, awakens genuine Buddha Dharma, and so forth. He goes on beyond that too. So this is, as I might have said before, this is a kind of turning point in this writing where he starts talking about this mutual assistance between, the person doing Zazen and all things in the Dharma realm. So he, throughout this writing, he kind of switches, perspective between, actually, it's just the perspective of the self, of how we view the self. So sometimes he talks about the self from the perspective of the Dharmakaya, or all things. Sometimes he talks about it from the individual person sitting. Sometimes he talks about it on a more, kind of Indra's net, perspective, the way they talk about it in the Avatamsaka Sutra, this Indra's net of interconnection throughout the entire universe. So he, goes back and forth in talking about the self in this way. But this part, he's really, I think, trying to dance around this theme of mutual assistance that we would talk about from a conventional, perspective. Mutual assistance. So, and this is where we really start to understand or talk about it in more conventional terms, that, our Zazen is an offering to all beings, and we're included in that. So it's important to understand that we're, not just doing Zazen in order to get enlightenment or get self-improvement or, get something for this individual person, but the individual person is included and yet, disappears. So it's a very, deep and boundless teaching, but we can look at it from many different ways. So what I wanted to do, probably the next few talks, or maybe just several more actually, is have a kind of theme going, if I could remember to do it. And the theme would be, boundaries. It's one way that we can talk about these kinds of teachings, is that we're really, talking about going beyond conventional boundaries in the way that we normally think of them. So the biggest boundary, that we create, that we really grasp onto and really believe in, of course, is our individuality, this individual self that, we have a sort of inbox and an outbox. We want to make sure that the inbox is okay and, manipulate the outbox to make it behave in the way that we want it to. So we don't want anything to come in that we don't like, and but we do want to get stuff in, that we do like. And so it's kind of one of the most, it's really the the basic boundary, the basic delusion, the basic foundation of ignorance is this kind of boundary. But so a lot of, what Dogen Zenji talks about is going beyond boundaries. And we can't really say that we're erasing boundaries either. That's a misunderstanding, as well of the teachings. So I think the way I like to talk about, boundaries, hopefully through the course of the next few talks, you can kind of categorize them into different sections. There's the normal way we would think of it, like physical boundaries or form boundaries, boundaries of the physical body and so forth, and objects of the sense organs. And then there's psychological boundaries or boundaries of the mind. And then also, I think Dogen Zenji talks about in this piece, spatial boundaries and temporal boundaries. And all of these things, all of these different boundaries are kind of, they're interconnected and fluid. That's kind of his point, that really you can't see where one begins and where another, ends. But for conventional purposes, we have to speak about, these things in this way. So really, from a certain perspective, we know that these boundaries really don't exist. That boundaries are really fluid and flexible and can't really be defined. You think of the boundary between Mexico and the United States, for example. You go up into a spaceship, or you see the image from a satellite, and there's no boundary there that's created in the earth. Although United States tried pretty hard for a period to make this physical, boundary. There's no, boundary there except for in our culture. And the boundary is very strong from a certain perspective, but from another perspective, it's not there, at all. It's the same thing with the boundaries that we have on every level, really, that we can think of. So, why is this so important, and why to study this kind of thing? First of all, just a reminder, of why we're talking about this section at all. Why do we talk about this kind of strange teaching that Dogen Zenji had in Bendowa? And it's a matter of understanding why we sit Zazen, and giving us the sort of motivation and faith to go and sit and base our life on this sitting practice, to understand that this isn't just sitting and staring at a wall, but to bring this sitting practice into everything that we do, every encounter that we have. And what he's talking about here, and what the Buddha talked about, was the subject-object relationship. That's one way that we can speak of it. That's one way that the Buddha, talked about delusion and awakening. And, he said that, just as I said a minute ago, when we have the in-box and the out-box, or when we see an object with the eye, the eye sense organ, or the seeing, the sight sense organ, or the eye, some kind of consciousness is triggered or arises. And he said that in that, consciousness or relationship from that contact is greed, hatred, and delusion. And that's really because the eye, arises. It was this kind of thing, of course, was refined more by other, by later schools of what happened, what's actually happened. And they gave it different names and stuff. But basically, it just says that's inherent in the subject-object relationship, that either you want to grasp the thing, or you want to push it away, or you don't care about it and you disregard it and maybe not, take care of it when you should. And you misunderstand it. You think that it's, the misunderstanding, the ignorance is the root of all of that. So it's a misunderstanding in the mind and in the body, the 5 skandhas. It's a deep misunderstanding, in the body and the mind. So that goes through everything we do in our life. If we encounter our life as something to manipulate and make it turn out the way we want it to, that's a recipe for suffering for ourselves and for others, of course. We have a certain amount of say in our experience, of course. We can make some choices, but most of the stuff that we encounter in our life, we don't have so-called, free will involved. We don't have the choice. So, and we might, be able to manipulate our environment to a certain degree. We might become a multi-billionaire and be able to do whatever, shoot off rockets and stuff. But it's sooner or later we encounter something we can't manipulate. Even the people at the highest, so-called realms of experience in this life. And if nothing else, you can't take it with you. All of the billions and all of the good deeds that you do that make you feel like your life is worthwhile, you can't take with you once, the reality of impermanence and your own death is facing you. And so, if you don't understand what this life is about, that it's going to be a problem sooner or later, even for those human beings that seem to be on, in these heavenly realms where all the desires are satisfied. So this is what, this is about, this subject-object relationship, and how, we go beyond this and accept it and actually use it too in our zazen and in our life. And so that's why this is an important, teaching to understand what is the meaning, of our zazen practice, and what is the nature of the self, according to Dogen Zenji and, Shakyamuni too. Dogen Zenji expounded it in a different way from his time and his experience and his own karma, but the foundations of the expression are from what the Buddha taught. And we all have to find, our own expression to expound the Dharma that's relative to our time and culture and our own heart and mind. Anyway, we see if we're not clear about this subject-object relationship, we find that in every encounter we have, it will be there working. So when we meet somebody new, when we're having a conversation, for example, with a person we've just met, is there something going on here or in the body, even trying to figure out what can I get from this person, or what is my status compared to this person? I mean, should I care about them or develop this relationship, or what can I get out of this? Basically, the kind of hunting mind. Or there's a way to practice with that when, we see it come up, of course. We're human beings and we see these kinds of things, come up. But when we study these teachings and understand the depth of that kind of delusion, we can change our relationship with it and practice with it and make it an expression of Dharma. So, and that's what Dogen Zenji says, Jijuyu Zanmai, we encounter everything as the self and employ it to make an offering. We encounter this self and give this self in this moment. So when we encounter someone I say this often, of course, do we really listen to them? We see what they're offering, and we encounter them as self, and we make an offering, back to them in our conversation, rather than trying to win the conversation or show them how superior we are or how submissive we are or whatever our particular way of, grasping the object might be. It might be that, our way of manipulating the object is to be, completely invisible, or whatever. It can manifest in many ways, or to subtly manipulate through other means that aren't verbal, whatever. So it's important, of course. This is important for the entirety of our lives. But this process, this eye making, the Buddha called, and the grasping is going on, all the time, whether we're aware of it or not, usually. So, and we'll talk more about this when we actually start talking more about, dropping off body and mind in this section, and cutting off tainted views and so forth. We can talk about it a little bit more. I know I often talk about that, but, it's important. So this dropping off body and mind, I will say a little bit about it. I think it's what the Buddha called, departing from the five skandhas. So, here's this section from the Pali Canon. I think it's Samyutta Nikaya. I can't remember exactly, but the Buddha just says, in brief, clinging to the five aggregates, or the five skandhas of the personality, clinging to the five skandhas or khandhas of the personality: body, feeling, perceptions, dispositions, and consciousness. That's a different translation of each of the five, skandhas. We see them translated different ways, but so clinging to those five skandhas as possessions of myself is suffering. And so that's one way. Another way he talked about suffering, he gave this model of the self, of this five skandhas. He gave it also the 18 elements, the subject-object relationship that I talked about, a moment ago. They're both, based on this contact and clinging to the object or to the self, the relationship between the subject and object itself. But this is one way that he talked about it, was this clinging to the five skandhas. And he wrote, or he said that one way that we can describe awakening is departing from the five skandhas. And to me, it's, Dogen Zenji says the same thing, dropping off body and mind. So there's five, skandhas, five skandhas, and one is form and the other are mind, so that's body and mind. So this is what Dogen Zenji, I think, is talking about with this dropping off body and mind. So, a particular way we can think of dropping off body and mind, and allowing that not only in our zazen, but off of the cushion, the way that it manifests in all of our life with zazen as the foundation, is to go beyond the boundaries, of body and mind. And so sometimes it's interesting to be reminded about these boundaries that we usually take for granted, so often. So, we all know this, of course, but it's really interesting. If you study the body, medically or from a scientific point of view, you can kind of look at it from this point of view that it's just a series of processes, rather than some kind of clear thing that's separate in its environment. So all the boundaries of the body are really about, bringing the body in harmony with its environment. So we're not trying to keep the environment away or, out as necessarily. I mean, you can look at it that way, but it's, it's a way to harmonize and regulate so that there can be harmony with a person's life and with a person's environment. So, for example, we have to nurture certain conditions in the body for it to be sustainable, for this life to be sustainable. We need to have a certain amount of heat or coolness and nurturing, of course, with calories that the body takes in, has to take in and out, oxygen, respiration has to happen. Water has to be regulated. And, for example, water, the body, of course, we know this is 60% water. And we think of the body as something solid, but 60% water. It's the blood is 90% water. And so we have a glass of water in front of us and we're thirsty, and we say, well, this is a glass of water. And we drink the glass of water and it becomes part of the body. It's very clear, but we don't think about it. That boundary, between the water and the body is really, really not there. And we can say this about the other functions of the body as well. The way that we breathe, the way that our skin regulates temperature, and the way we take in nutrients. So any of those boundaries, like the skin, if you look at the skin, it's something that, as I said, regulates the relationship between the environment and the organism. So it's not something to keep a defined separation. In fact, if you start looking closely at things like the skin and anything, actually, you start seeing that it doesn't exist. The smaller and smaller perspective that you have of anything, any boundary, something like the human skin, you find that it's full of pores, and you find that it's the very nature of its ability to function is its flexibility and its ability to be permeated in a certain way. And then, of course, if we keep going on down on more and more minute levels, today we know from a scientific perspective that matter itself, we can't really say it's there the way it was originally thought. And when you really get down to a real quantum level, it's hard to understand exactly what's going on. There's nothing called a solid thing at all that would define something from its environment, So this is, as I say, this is pretty well known. There's a statement given by a physicist, and it's over 10, 12 years old now. So who knows if he's still saying this, because I know research has gone a long ways, but his name is quoted, where is it? I like to quote it because it sounds almost like a Buddhist scripture. His name is Henry Stapp. And he says, no such brain exists. No brain, body, or anything else in the real world is composed of those tiny bits of matter that Newton imagined the universe to be made of. So, we're familiar with this kind of understanding. So it's, I think, as I say, interesting and important to kind of examine these kinds of boundaries that we usually cling to so hard and think are so solid. But the other perspective is that we absolutely need these boundaries. So sometimes the teaching kind of gets twisted and to say, well, there are no boundaries or we don't need boundaries. And that's another big problem, So as I often talk about in the Kachayana Sutta, when the Buddha said, we see the arising of things and we don't get, stuck in the realm or the understanding of the self as non-existence. We see the passing away of things. We see the emptiness, or we see the quantum reality of things, and we don't get stuck in the perspective that things actually exist. So if we don't take care of our boundaries, where there's no human life. But if we really believe in those boundaries, there's no awakening. There's no understanding of the nature of human life. So that's why the Dharma is so hard to understand and so profound, is that we go beyond boundaries. We don't give them up. We don't say the self doesn't really exist, but we don't say it does exist. I mean, if we cling to either one of those understandings of the boundaries of the self, we have a big problem. Usually what we do is we tend to grasp to the existence of things. So that's why so many teachings are based in these emptiness teachings, But if you really study the emptiness teachings, you will find existence there. You'll find existence and non-existence there. Emptiness doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the way that we normally think of it, that it's null and void and nothing. But when as I say, this boundary is flexible and always changing, and it can't be defined. So, if you don't recognize it, you have a big problem. So when there's a boundary between individuals, we'll talk more about psychological boundaries, but when psychological or social boundaries are not respected in a Zen monastery or in the United Nations or between individual people, there's a big problem, So the boundaries don't really exist. The fact that I'm ultimately living the same life as you doesn't mean you have the right to do whatever you want to me, but to live in that's why to live in harmony is for all of us to agree and understand on some level about the boundaries, and also understand that they're fluid and flexible and not real. So when we think of them as ultimately real, when we think that Americans are the greatest people on earth, or that Christians are, or Buddhists are the best people, then we start saying those people need to either change or get out of our country, or whatever, at the worst case scenario, be eliminated, whatever it might be. So on some level, we know there are no Buddhists and there are no Muslims. Somebody isn't born saying, with the Muslim gene in them or the Buddhist gene, or there's not the same thing with race. There's no, race is a human concept. But if we don't recognize race in our society, we have a big problem at this point now, because, different cultures have different ways of doing things, and different cultures have been disproportionately, marginalized. And if we don't recognize that, we can't take care of it. We say everything is the same, and there are no races, so I don't care. And then we can't see how someone might have a different perspective and a different life experience than we do. Because on that level, the boundary, is real. But the secret to really practicing with the boundary is to know that it doesn't, on another level, that doesn't exist. So this whole thing of dropping off body and mind in our zazen, this is the time when we can really forget about the self. To study the self is to forget the self and to drop it off. And that's why, sitting zazen or doing some sort of non-discriminative practice is a foundation, for us. And it's something that we endeavor to be doing really all of the time. But normally when we interact with people, we need to understand, well, this person is different than me in some way, and so that I can understand their perspective. If I don't make any discrimination at all when I encounter someone, they might be from a different country where they approach things differently than we do. And I might deeply misinterpret our communication if I don't make some discrimination, some discrimination within non-discrimination. In other words, knowing that all of my discriminations are limited and ultimately unreal, but yet, necessary. But in our zazen, in our sitting, we can actually let go of all of that. And that's why this is a kind of special thing, for lack of a better word, in a realm that's beyond special and mundane, So, I'm going on too long here. So, let's see. I'll just make a couple other points about this, just a little bit of an examination of like the form boundary, the human body, for example, just to kind of think of these things in a little bit different way. We have to take in things that we normally don't call ourselves. We have to digest other living beings, actually. We have to take those in to our body, and then they're expelled in some way too. And what we expel becomes life for other beings, and ultimately even our own body, goes back to the earth. And so there's this constant change and exchange and flow of life that isn't an individual thing. We're all kind of living this same life, on one level. But so sooner or later, all of these constituents return to sort of emptiness, or return to something beyond our individuality. All of the human body, sooner or later. And this kind of thinking made me think about the statement that Dogen Zenji says a few lines down in Jijuyu Zanmai. He says, at this time, because earth, grasses, and trees, fences, and walls, tiles, and pebbles, all things in the Dharma realm in the 10 directions carry out Buddha work. And so this is the kind of thing I think we often get hung up on and skeptical about when we read some of Dogen's stuff, his early stuff especially, or in this Jijuyu Zanmai. And so just to get kind of abstract about it, but we've talked about this before. The reason we talk about time, for example, in our zazen is that basically we understand on this level there is no time. There's only the present moment. And so we're living in this present moment that is eternal, this beyond eternity and impermanence. We can't really call it either, of course, but it's the same now. If we really understand this in our own life, or when we start practicing, we start doing zazen, especially, we start understanding we never leave this now. And so, so there are, there are beings sort of practicing with us that we've consumed, for example, when we do zazen, or in the future, so-called future, all of our future activities are contained in some way, in our zazen, or the fruit, from a conventional level, the kind of fruit of things that have come before us, the same now is manifest in our body and mind. Again, from a scientific perspective, we understand, we know that we're made out of the same stuff as stars. The current theory is that there was this one sort of singular thing called the Big Bang, eons ago, and all time and space and matter arose from that. So it gets kind of trippy, but that is actually absolutely what we're practicing with now. We're in the same now as then, as the Big Bang. And so all of these things are our brothers and sisters, or mothers and fathers. All things, in the Dharma realm are us. And so we're really, all of these things are practicing, because when we let go of our concepts, of our, as I say, these boundaries, we're all just in this reality of here and now together with all beings, all tiles, walls, pebbles, grasses, and trees, all participating in our zazen. And we, in the future, might be grass. We in the future might be pebbles. We might be cement in the ground. The elements of our body, go back to the earth and become, something else. Or we might be, part of a bird, or caterpillars, or asphalt, whatever. And so, but we're simply sitting into the reality beyond, time, our concepts of time and distance, that we really only exist, in our minds. So, we'll talk more about that. And I know it's sort of abstract, as I say, but once we start really sitting and noticing our life and settling down, I think we start understanding more deeply, the truth or the reality, of these teachings. So I think that's all I'll say today. And it's gone on kind of long. So I'll stop here and see if anyone has anything they'd like to say. Yoho had something.
Well, I guess you sparked some questions of yes, if our physical bodies are literally a part of everything, and we're our atoms, when we die, kind of break up and go into different things, and like you said, we could be grass or this or that. Does that, like, what happens with the consciousness part then? Is that something that is even contained in the physical body, or is that something that's actually the whole universe is conscious, you know? So it's like, you know, we just become a little piece of that consciousness, or the grass consciousness, you know, or we're the asphalt consciousness, or, you know, like maybe we don't at that level have the capacity to have the same ideas and thoughts that we, or at least that we think we do in our human form. But I mean, I know my cats are thinking. I mean, they certainly have little kitty thoughts, and they follow them. So so it's like, is it just I don't know. Can you address or do you have more thoughts you can share about the consciousness part of what happens to us?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And these kinds of questions, of course, arise when we start talking about this kind of thing. You know, what is consciousness? Where does it go when we die? It's a perennial question of human beings. Where does it come from? Where does it go? And there are, you know, so many teachings about this, and there are sort of the traditional, you know, Buddhist teachings about consciousness and its origins, and different schools express it, you know, in different ways. One thing I would say, what I like to say about it is, from Dogen Zenji's perspective and from my perspective, I try to keep, you know, sort of personal speculation out of it as much. And the other thing I would say is that what I just said about, you know, quantum physics and science and physiology, all of that is really bound in our own particular mythos, our own particular time, and our own particular culture. And the bias of human beings today, I think, is that we think we're really getting it all figured out. You know, you know, and it may be that it's true, that this is the true sort of way to describe reality. But we know, like your question, for example, brings up the issue that science is starting to understand, that human experience cannot be left out of the equation to describe reality. You know, the human experience of consciousness. It used to be for years, it was just said it doesn't really exist, especially the behavioralist schools back in the middle, you know, 20th century. They said you don't need to account for consciousness. It's irrelevant. And everything can be described by a system of reinforcement or operant or classical conditioning, this kind of thing. But we know that that is not our experience. And there is some question about, what is this? You know, what is going on here? And the thing about Dogen Zenji, you know, as I say, he never gives us anywhere, you know, to land, because first of all, any answer that we give, we can probe into that and find difficulty with it. Any answer, any perspective, you know, any perspective in as I say, in that scientific view, or even the quantum level, you know, they still can't figure out how these theories, you know, the quantum, like they're trying to unify the theories, they don't jive with each other. Like gravity doesn't go along with quantum, you know, theory. I don't understand this stuff really, but none of it, you know, nobody has come up with something that really describes everything from that perspective. But yeah, so when we talk about it from the scientific view, there's a certain way that a certain amount of that seems to jive with Buddhist, you know, theory, but it is different. I think we have to understand too, it's different in that people 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago probably looked at things quite a bit, you know, differently than we do now. And we might be missing something that these ancient people understood, you know, that we don't, because of our insistence on, the fact that human experience is, from a scientific standpoint, doesn't count. But I think that's changing, from what I understand, as scientists are starting to understand that can't just be left out. But what I would say, one thing is that Dogen Zenji never had a theory about anything, as far as like a metaphysical foundation for life that we can say, this is it, and this is the nature of the mind, and this is what happens after death. Although it seems, he's pretty traditional, really, when it comes down to rebirth and so forth. When you really get down to it, he has some pretty conventional things to say. But in his more grand writings, in like Shobogenzo, the closest thing he really comes to saying, I think, in my understanding, about the nature of consciousness is to say, and Matthew brought this up a week or so ago, there's the famous koan about the sixth ancestor, and two monks are arguing about a flag flapping in the wind. And one monk is saying, it's the wind that's moving. And the other monk says, no, it's the flag that's moving. And the sixth ancestor, comes along and says, actually, it's your mind that's moving. And the two monks, their mind was blown, because the great teacher came and told them something that they had never heard of or thought of before. And Dogen Zenji took it one step further and said, all things are moving. The mind is moving, the wind is moving, the flag is moving. All beings are making that. All things are involved in consciousness. I mean, it's the same thing he said about Buddha nature. You can't possess Buddha nature, you are Buddha nature. But then you go and you'll find something where he'll negate that. He won't let you stay there and say, once you say, oh, consciousness is everything, he will find some way to pull the rug out from underneath you and say, actually, no. and the reason is that keep practicing, keep investigating, and see for yourself, and don't get stuck in a dogma, or don't start, reifying. But so, yeah, the way that I would express it, and I think there's no, Dogen's teaching, there's no kind of metaphysical idealism or, and even the Yogacara teachings, that some people consider idealism, I don't think the great masters never really said that mind is everything. They just didn't say, they were, I think, the same as Dogen. They didn't really say, but they described, our experience. And they didn't say, this is it, this is what it all means, the ones. So anyway, and the point of that is that you have to keep practicing, and you have to keep manifesting, and you have to keep investigating. And the closest thing I think he comes to say is that practice, this is practice itself, is the understanding, the wisdom, and the manifestation. So, and basically it's beyond expression in our language, even though we try. But that's the reason he never gives you a place to say, this is definitively it. But it's interesting, when we could discuss it, we could talk about it. And, but it would just, to me, it would just be sort of something fun to do. And maybe we would learn something about, the teachings and our experience, and maybe open our minds But as far as, really finding the definitive thing to call it, I'm not sure. If you say that's impossible, that's clinging too. If you say you can't do it, that also is a view. So you can't even say that.
Thank you.
Thank you.